Hello and welcome to today's lesson. I'm your hard-working but indefatigable teacher, Mr. Burton. You will need to watch this video and take notes as you go. You may need to watch certain parts of the video a few times to ensure complete understanding. This is your homework and I will check your notes tomorrow before we get started. I hope you learned something.
Okay, on to our third instalment in our elasticity unit. Today we're looking at income elasticity of demand. And income elasticity of demand essentially tells us whether we're looking at a normal good and whether that normal good is a necessity or a luxury, or if in fact we are looking at an inferior good. We know that income affects the demand curve. It will shift the demand curve. An increase in income will increase demand, and a decrease in income will decrease demand.
Income elasticity of demand is a measure of how consumer demand changes when income changes. The formula for income elasticity of demand is percent change in quantity demanded divided by percent change in income. Plotting income elasticity of demand on a graph where income is on the x-axis and quantity is on the y-axis will render a line that has a unique slope according to the type of good. For instance, luxury items have a positive income elasticity of demand. On the graph, a luxury goods curve will slope upward from left to right, meaning as income increases, demand for those types of good increases. The steeper the slope, the more income elastic the good is said to be. Conversely, goods described as inferior goods have a downward sloping curve. This means that as income increases, demand for those types of goods decreases. Examples of inferior goods are public transportation and canned goods. Finally, some goods are immune from demand changes due to changes in income. These types of goods have a curve that is flat, meaning demand stays the same as income rises. These are usually consumer staples that people buy no matter what their income. Examples include soap and toilet paper. Businesses use income elasticity of demand to forecast sales and plan production for their products.
Okay, so here's our definition of income elasticity of demand, which we'll shorten to YED. This is a measure of the relationship between a change in quantity demand for a particular good and a change in real income. Normal goods.
Normal good is any good or service that sees an increase in demand due to an increase in income. Normal, in this sense, does not refer to quality or type of product. Normal goods are defined by having an income elasticity of demand coefficient that is lower than 1, but still a positive number. The formula for calculating income elasticity of demand is percent change in quality demanded divided by percent change in income. While demand for normal goods will increase as income increases, the increase in demand will not be as large as the increase in income. Normal goods are the opposite of inferior goods.
Okay, so normal goods are any goods for which demand increases when income increases and falls when income decreases, but price remains constant. So, income elasticity of demand, if it is positive, then we're talking about a normal good. As income increase, the demand curve will shift right and the quantity demanded of the good will also increase. And that's the opposite of inferior goods, where an increase in income will result in a decrease in demand for a budget inferior good. Okay, let's have a look at YED and normal goods. And our example here, consumer income increasing by 10%. And we have fur coats. Where demand meets supply, we have our initial equilibrium, determining the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity demanded and supplied. Let's say there's an increase in demand for fur coats. That will cause a demand shift to increase. Demand to increase, price will increase, and the quantity demanded and supplied will reach a new greater, higher equilibrium. Okay, with income elastic demand, a more than proportional change in quantity demanded as income changes. Whereas we have another type of good or service, this time electricity. An increase in income is going to have a much smaller effect on the demand curve. Like, demand is going to increase by relatively less than for a luxury good like a fur coat, electricity being a necessity. So here we see that an increase in income increases by 10%. With income inelastic demand, the change is less than proportional as income changes. So we have the income increases by 10%. That causes a change in quantity demanded of only 5%. Whereas for a luxury good, like a fur coat, that change in income results in a much greater change in quantity demanded. So income's increased by 10%. The quantity demanded for fur coats may increase by 45%. Now, the value of YED will provide important information as to how much the quantity demanded of a good will change in response to increases or decreases in the consumer income. Inferior goods being the opposite.
The term inferior good does not describe a lack of quality, but rather is an economic term used when discussing the elasticity of demand for a particular good or service. Income elasticity of demand is a measure of how consumer demand changes for a good or service when consumer income changes. As consumers' income increases, the demand for inferior goods decreases. Examples of inferior goods are public transportation and generic branded goods. Plotting income elasticity of demand for an inferior good on a graph where income is on the x-axis and quantity is on the y-axis will render a downward sloping curve. The steeper the slope, the more the demand will drop with even small increases in income. For instance, if Ramon received a $5 a week increase in pay, he might switch from a generic brand of toothpaste to Crest toothpaste. The toothpaste would be said to have a steeply sloping elasticity of demand curve, but the $5 a week increase will not cause Ramon to rip up his bus pass and buy a car. For that to happen, Ramon would need a much larger increase in his income. Therefore, the elasticity demand curve for public transportation is much flatter because it takes a large increase in income for demand to drop.
So let's have a look at YED and inferior goods. Consumer income increasing by 10% again. Fur coats being the opposite of an inferior good, an absolute luxury. So income increasing by 10%, resulting in a large increase in demand, a large shift of the demand curve there. So income's going up by 10%, and the quantity demanded going up by relatively more, 45% in this case. So this is a normal good. It's a positive relationship between income and demand. As income increases, demand increases as well. A plus plus. Whereas if we have a look at an inferior good, instant coffee, for example, where supply meets demand, we have our initial equilibrium price and quantity. Now, as income increases with an inferior good, demand will decrease. An inferior good has an inverse relationship between income and demand. So as incomes increase, that's a positive. Incomes are climbing, plus demand decreases. That's a negative. So inverse relationship between income and demand. So this means that the positive or negative sign of our YED coefficient, which we'll learn how to calculate very, very soon, is going to provide important information as to whether the good is inferior or normal. If it's inferior, our coefficient that we calculate will come out negative, and if it's a normal good, it will come out positive. Okay, so how to calculate YED? Now, the formula should look pretty familiar. We have the Q on top, quantity demanded on top, and this time we've got the percentage change in income on the bottom, which means that we can still use our mnemonic here. Q is above everything. Quantity demanded is above everything. And in this case, it's above income. The queen is above the yeoman. Okay, given the percentages, we can do the calculation very easily. If income decreases by 10% and the quantity demanded of good X increases by 5%, that's plus 5.5 divided by negative 10. And our YED coefficient will turn out to be negative 0.55. And again, unlike price elasticity of demand, the positive and negative are important. Positive signaling an increase and negative signaling a decrease in either incomes or quantity demanded here. And again, IB economics exams, you may well be asked to, you'll be given numeric information and we'll have to calculate our percentages ourselves before we can use our formula. So we know our formula there, and we know how to calculate percentages. So here we've got a change in income from 10,000 to 9,000. So this is a decrease in income. So that's the original minus the new divided by the original times 100 to give us the percentages. And the percentage change in quantity demanded, we have the quantity demand of X decreasing from 1,000 units to 880. So again, that's original minus the new divided by the original multiplied by 100. In this case, it's a decrease, so we're looking at negative 12% here. And once we've got that information, we've got our two percentages. We can plug that into our formula. So minus 12 divided by minus 10, and that will turn into a positive 1.2. So how do we interpret these YED values? So remember, there are three main things we're looking at. Is it a normal good or inferior? And if we can determine whether it is a normal good, can we use our YED to tell us whether that good is a necessity or a luxury? And the answer is yes, we can. So if after doing our calculations, our YED coefficient is greater than 0 but less than 1, we call this income inelastic, normal good, and it indicates a necessity. This means that the change in quantity demand is relatively unresponsive to changes in income. So for an example, perhaps income increases by 10%, quantity demanded increasing by 2%. Now if YED is greater than 1, we're talking about income elastic, and again we're talking about a normal good because it's a positive. And in this case, when it's greater than 1, we can define that good as being a luxury. And here the change in quantity demand is relatively responsive to changes in income. An example would be income increasing by 10%, then quantity demanded increasing by proportionally more, say 14%. And we know we're looking at an inferior good if our coefficient, our YED coefficient, turns out to be negative, less than 0. And this means a change in quantity demanded is negatively related to changes in income. So for example, income increasing by 10%, quantity demanded decreasing by 5%. Income increasing by 10%, the quantity demanded of instant coffee decreasing by 5%. An inferior good. And if we put this information into a graph with consumer spending on the y-axis and level of income on the x, we will see different patterns of consumer spending as a function of level of income here. So consumer spending, how much a good consumers will purchase, we're talking about quantity demanded here, and the level of income, income elasticity of demand, examines the relationship between income and how much of a good consumers will purchase. So we're talking about quantity demanded again, consumer spending. Now for luxury goods, we have this strongly upward sloping curve. As income increases, people can afford to substitute for expensive, high quality and prestigious goods. Still a positive relationship here. Consumer spending is increasing as the level of income increases, but this time it's relatively flat. And this indicates that we're talking about a necessity good. People don't spend that much extra money on these once they've consumed a certain amount. There's only a certain amount of electricity we need. Keep the television on, keep the lights on, keep the phones charged. Necessity goods. Income increases, our expenditure on something like electricity doesn't increase by that much. And then if we've got the pattern occurring in the opposite direction, as the level of income increases, consumer spending actually decreases. So this indicates an inferior good. As income is increasing, people begin to substitute these goods for better quality goods. There's some applications here, YED and the business cycle.
The business cycle refers to the fluctuations in economic activity that an economy experiences over a period. It consists of expansions, or periods of economic growth, and contractions, or periods of economic decline. During expansions, employment, production, sales, and incomes increase. During contractions, also called recessions, unemployment rises, production slows, sales decrease, and incomes stagnate or decline. The housing boom of the 2000s is an example of the expansionary part of the business cycle. The Great Recession that followed, which technically lasted from December 2007 to June 2009, is an example of the contractionary part of the business cycle. The National Bureau of Economic Research determines the official dates for business cycles in the United States. It calculates that since 1945, the average expansion has lasted about 58 months, and the average contraction has lasted about 11 months. However, since the 1990s, the average expansion has lasted 95 months, while the average contraction has still been just 11 months. Investors who think they can time the market may be able to profit from business cycles by choosing the right stocks. Meredith knows that cyclical stocks, such as commodity and technology stocks, tend to outperform at the beginning of an expansion, so she tries to purchase them at the end of the contraction when they are underpriced, then sell them at a profit in the early part of the expansion. When Meredith thinks the economy is overheating, she buys healthcare, consumer staples, and utility stocks, which tend to outperform during recessions because of their stable cash flows and dividend yields. Many economists consider the business cycle to be a natural part of economic activity. Some economists, however, believe that if the central bank did not manipulate interest rates and the money supply, business cycles would be less severe or might even disappear altogether.
Okay, that was quite a bit of information there. And the business cycle, we're going to look at it in much more detail in our macroeconomics unit. So it's a little way away yet. So the key point to take away from the business cycle is that incomes tend to increase. Income and employment tends to increase in an expansion phase of the business cycle when the economy is booming. And incomes and employment tend to decrease when the economy is heading into negative territories, which has implications for our income elasticity of demand. Income's increasing, income's decreasing. Okay, so the business cycle, our model looks something like this. We've got income, which is our real GDP. On our y-axis, time. On our x-axis. And real GDP is a measure of actual output, how much an economy is actually producing. And that's an indication of national incomes as well. And then we have a long-term growth trend. Recessions indicated by the negative slope of our business cycle. Trough is right down the bottom. Expansion, when our economic output, real GDP, starts to turn positive, the economy is growing. And the peak is before the end of the expansion and the start of the recession again. So repeated fluctuation of positive and negative economic growth around a long-term growth trend. Positive output, when economic output, real GDP, and incomes are greater than the long-term growth trend. And negative output is when real GDP, which is economic output, and incomes is below the long-term growth trend. And again, we're going to go into the business cycle in a lot more detail in macroeconomics. So that's we're talking months away. But the key point to note is that incomes increasing during an expansion and incomes decreasing during a recession. Now, a recession is a period of decreasing economic activity, also known as an economic contraction or downturn, during which unemployment is increasing, investment is decreasing, and we have more business values in the economy. Now, a recession is said to occur if there are 2 or more consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. Trough, a period of economic activity which has significant numbers of unemployed, very low levels of business confidence, a slowing of price rises. Now, economies sooner or later will emerge from a recession into a period of economic growth, which is an expansion or an economic recovery. The expansion, this is a period of increasing economic activity during which unemployment is falling, investment is taking place, and prices are rising. And at the very top of the expansion, a period of very active economic activity where real GDP growth is growing at its fastest rate. And here, unemployment is at its lowest, investment is at its highest, and economy experiences the largest rate of increase in the prices of goods or services at the peak of the business cycle. Now, key point here, in periods of strong economic growth and rising incomes, income elastic goods will have a strong increase in sales. Income inelastic goods are going to have limited sales growth. Inferior goods will have declining sales. So it's all related to incomes. Remember, incomes are increasing in periods of strong economic growth. Whereas conversely, in periods of recession and falling incomes, income elastic goods will have a strong decrease in sales. Income inelastic goods will have relatively stable sales. They won't fall too much. Inferior goods will have increasing sales. So the business cycle, take a note of it, and we'll go into it in much more detail later. Now, the rate of industry expansion. As incomes in an economy increase, there is an increasing demand for goods and services. So suppose that an economy has an annual long-term average rate of income growth of 3%. Now, for goods and services that are income elastic, so the YED is greater than 1, this means that demand is going to increase by more than 3%. Conversely, for goods and services where the industry has income inelastic demand, our YED is less than 1, then demand will increase by less than the 3%. So assuming increased economic growth in the future, the higher the value of YED for an industry, the greater the share of the economy that industry will have over time. And the more income inelastic an industry is, the relative size of the industry within an economy is going to decrease over time. Thus, income inelastic goods will become relatively more important for economies' economic growth and employment, and income inelastic goods less important over time. Fur coats are going to be more important over time, and electricity somewhat less important over time. And we can relate this to sectors of the economy. Like every economy has our 3 sectors: the primary, the secondary, the tertiary. Primary products involving the retrieval of production of raw materials, as we know from our fundamentals of economics topic. Things such as corn, coal, wood, and iron. A coal miner and a farmer would be workers in the primary sector. Manufacturing, our secondary sector, involves the transformation of raw or intermediate materials into goods, So we're talking about turning things like steel into cars, textiles into clothing. Now a builder or a dressmaker would be workers in the manufacturing sector. Tertiary, our services sector, this involves the supplying of services to consumers and businesses, things such as babysitting, cinema, and banking. A shopkeeper and an accountant would be examples of workers in our services sector. So what does this mean? Now, as economies grow and real income per capita increases, then industries within the different sectors of the economy are going to experience different rates of growth depending on the income elasticity of demand of their products. Primary commodities such as food have relatively inelastic YED, and over time with increased real household incomes, the agricultural sector of an economy will come to represent proportionally less of all economic activity within a country. And we can see that going across the different types of countries here. Less developed countries, example Mozambique, agriculture is a huge chunk of the economy. Developed country, such as Indonesia, agricultural sector starts to fall away, manufacturing becomes more important, as do services. Whereas with developed countries like Sweden, Australia, and the UK, services have the lion's share of the economy. Agriculture, just a little part. Okay, manufacturing industries will continue to grow up to a point as economic growth boosts incomes. As consumer income increases, manufactured goods such as TVs and computers generally have relatively elastic demand. Increasing incomes will mean more of these manufactured goods will be produced and consumed, and output and employment in these industries will expand relative to industries within the agricultural sector, such as forestry and fisheries. But more importantly, service industries such as banking, insurance, travel, and hospitality have the most income elastic demand. And increases in income spur high levels of growth within these industries. So, for example, the higher consumer's income, the more expensive her house and the more expensive her insurance premiums. In developed economies where incomes are highest, firms operating in the service sector account for the bulk of economic activity and output, and inelastic primary products account for only a small percentage of all economic output and employment. So, less developed country, developing country, developed countries. Growth in income is what essentially defines the differences between these three different types of economies. And we can see the effects there on the agriculture, manufacturing, and services sector as income increases. And this is all related to YED, income elasticity of demand.